Today's program. There's a couple of comments that there wasn't any sound. You guys got it? Okay, great. Sorry, we don't have music going with our screen share at the beginning of the program, which I should put music to it, but I haven't. Anyway, welcome everyone to today's program. My name is Lisa Versace. I am the Programs and Engagement Manager here at the California Preservation Foundation. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, CPF is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We provide statewide leadership, advocacy, and education to ensure the protection of California's diverse cultural heritage and its historic resources. Our work is made possible by the generous support of our members, donors, and sponsors. CPF offers individual memberships starting at just $50 annually and complimentary two-year memberships to full-time students. Our website, californiapreservation.org, is where you can find out more on membership, as well as on future programs and events. Today's program is brought to you by annual education sponsor Wisjani Elsner Associates Incorporated, as well as our program sponsor, Groundwork Preservation, LLC. We're joined today by guest speaker Russell Kale, a licensed structural engineer and principal and president of Structural Focus. Russell will be further introduced by today's moderator, Carrie Chasteen. Carrie is an expert in historic preservation with over 23 years of experience in cultural resource management. Thank you, Russell and Carrie, for joining us today. And Carrie, I'll hand it over to you to get today's program underway.
Thank you, Lisa, and welcome everybody. I've had the pleasure to work with Russell on a couple of projects, so I'm excited to introduce him. Russell is a licensed California structural engineer with over 26 years of experience. Though much of his work has focused on historic preservation, adaptive reuse, and renovations, he also has extensive experience with new construction. Excuse me. Russell has worked on a wide range of projects from cultural and education spaces to media production facilities and commercial buildings, with notable projects including the Huntington Library Rose Garden Tea Room, the Cheech Marin Center for Chicano Art in Riverside, LA's Union Station, and the John Anson Ford Amphitheater. Thank you, Russell, for joining us today. We look forward to learning more about you and your path to preservation, and I will turn it over to you at this point.
Thank you very much, Carrie. Let me share my screen and we'll get underway. My apologies. I was ready to do this. Okay, here we go. Okay, so thank you again, Carrie. As Carrie mentioned, my name is Russell Kale. I'm the president and principal at Structural Focus. We are a 23-person consulting engineering firm in the Los Angeles area. And today I'll talk to you about my path to preservation. So let's jump right in. Of course, there's always going to be a challenge. Sorry, my apologies.
Do you need Lisa to drive for you?
No, there we go.
You got it.
So I'll start with why historic preservation. And I love this quote by George Santayana. Those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. I think this is particularly interesting in the historic preservation world because so many of our historic, fascinating buildings and places have stories to tell. And we need to make sure that we learn from those. And the best way to learn from those is to make sure that those buildings and places are preserved. So for me, historic preservation is a lot of things. It's fascinating, it's challenging, it's educational, it's exciting, it's interesting, can occasionally be controversial, but most importantly, it's worth the effort. And I would say in particular for future generations. To me, making sure that these historically relevant places are available for my children and my grandchildren to see is really, really critical. And so a large portion of my career is shaped by that passion of mine. So historic preservation has given me the opportunity to work on iconic structures like this. This was the first historic preservation project I worked on. That's the Hotel del Coronado, an amazing, beautiful building, and I've gone and climbed around many areas that the guests don't get to go to. So a little bit about me and my career. I got my bachelor's degree from New Mexico State University in 1996. In 1998, I graduated from the University of Texas at Austin with my master's degree. And I moved out to California. I went to work at Degenkolb Engineers in Los Angeles, in their Los Angeles office. Worked there for 3 years and then jumped over to Structural Focus, where I'm currently employed. I'm a part owner at Structural Focus, and I was promoted to president in 2023. And then a couple of just professional career items. I became a licensed professional engineer with a civil engineering license in 2000. And then in 2004, I obtained my structural engineering license, also in civil engineering. And then last year, I joined the board for the Los Angeles Conservancy, which is I'm very proud of. Okay, so let's talk about my path to preservation. Preservation wasn't anything that I learned about in college. To be honest with you, I had no idea what preservation was. But I was very fortunate. I had the good fortune of being hired by David Koch at Degenkolb, and then he left and started Structural Focus in 2001. And I headed over and joined him later that year. Unique little fact, September 11, 2001 was my first day at Structural Focus. And I was late for work that day, but it was great to be going back to work for my previous boss because he understood. So there's David. Some of you may very well recognize him. And he's very well known in the preservation world, and that has opened up a lot of doors for me to work on amazing historic projects over the course of my career. That allowed me to develop a passion for working on incredible buildings, and that's something that is a big part of my career. So let's get to some interesting photos. These are historic preservation projects that I've worked on in my career. I mentioned the Hotel del Coronado, the John Anson Ford Amphitheater, Carrie alluded to. This is a beautiful open air outdoor amphitheater that is directly across the 101 freeway from the Hollywood Bowl. What's very unique about it is the backdrop for the stage is this hill, and they have this series of tiered retaining walls that they apply some amazing lighting to. As you can see in the photo in the middle, this was the opening gala where a tap dancer named Savion Glover performed, and it was an amazing, amazing evening. The next few projects that I've worked on, one of my favorites in my career, the Wilshire Boulevard Temple here in Los Angeles. Here are a couple snippets of the analysis model that we used to evaluate the building and come up with a seismic strengthening or seismic retrofit scheme that was implemented. This is one of my favorite projects, in large part because it's a dome structure, which is always fun to work on a dome structure. But also, the client was incredibly interested in doing a seismic retrofit and completing a seismic retrofit that would allow their building to be around for many, many, many years to come. And as I mentioned, future generations deserve that. Another historic preservation project that is one of my favorites is the Rancho Los Alamitos campus or site in Long Beach. We did a historic barns restoration. The Rancho Los Alamitos was originally a 30,000 square foot ranch, and it has been dwindled down to 7.5 acres now. And you can see most of that here in this shot. In particular, the barns restoration project involved the relocation on site of these 5 barn structures. And we also did a seismic retrofit. But seismic retrofits of historic buildings always need to be sensitive to the existing historic fabric of the buildings. So the blacksmith shop was relocated. Some of these barns were only relocated by 50 or 100 feet, but they were looking to reorganize the buildings on the site so that they could incorporate some special features that I'll allude to in a minute. So there are the barns that we retrofit, or that we relocated and retrofit. here's some photos about what that relocation process looks like. It's a very interesting process and intriguing, and was a lot of fun on this project. I'm going to go back a couple slides. The horse barn was one of the buildings you can see here in the bottom left. And that horse barn is this portion of this building right here. We incorporated, or we added, a new addition onto the side, which is called the Rancho Center. And that has their main lobby as you come in, and a large meeting room for various events. I will just add that the Rancho is free to come and take a look at. It's in Long Beach, and it's a really great stop if you're in the Los Angeles area. And then historic preservation, I have to say, is can sometimes be challenging. This is a building that I think a lot of people would probably say doesn't look like it should or could be historic. It's a milking parlor in Ontario, California, but it was critically important to the history of the region. And so I got a call from a developer that was looking to develop a strip mall in this area, and they were told they needed to look into the possibility of relocating this building. Well, it's always fun that the conversation quickly turned to the gentleman that called me saying, "There's no way the building can be moved. Can you please write me a report that says it must be torn down?" And our response to those comments like that are always, we're generally interested in saving historic buildings that tell the rich history of the region. We're not going to be somebody that will write a report just because they want this building out of their way. So with that, I'll briefly talk about this last photo, and then I'll open it up for questions. This is the Plaza Theater in Palm Springs. It's a historic theater that's currently in construction. The retrofit, or we're doing a seismic retrofit, and they're doing a rehabilitation to upgrade it to a more current theater experience. So with that, I will open it up to questions. Would you like me to stop sharing my screen, or what's the best next step here?
Yeah, why don't you stop sharing your screen so we can see you and Carrie?
Oh, sure.
So to get the questions rolling, how about Russell, can you please tell us some about what career accomplishments are you most proud of?
Sure. I think, I won't say pivoting, but learning about historic preservation and having the opportunity here at Structural Focus, and having worked for David Koch my entire career, embracing that challenge and passion in my career is something that I see serving me well for a long time through the rest of my career.
Are there certain things an emerging professional interested in this field should be doing to learn skills that will help them prepare for this career? So I guess, in essence, what are the steps you would recommend for somebody interested in becoming a structural engineer and working in the field of historic preservation?
Absolutely. I would encourage you to get involved with the historic preservation organizations, CPF being a large one. Here in Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Conservancy advocates for historic places and sites here in Los Angeles and Los Angeles County. What that does is that gives you the opportunity to educate yourself and understand what historic buildings are and why they're historic. And I always like to point out that, like the milking parlors that I talked about, not all buildings are historic in everybody's mind. What's critical about historic and history is the passion of the local community sometimes. A little side story that's a little bit funny is my father was born on a dairy farm in Western New York. And when I told him I was working on some historic milking parlors and I showed him that photo, he was like, "What's historic about those?" So I explained to him why it was important to that region and important to the people that live there. There are still several farms out there, and that actually was an operating barn on this farm. So educating yourself, understanding where the historic places are in your area, and getting involved with these organizations will go a long way because it's as much about meeting the people that uh, are in the historic preservation arena that helps you get started in moving toward doing projects that are historically relevant.
Following on with that, what career accomplishments are you most proud of?
Career accomplishments. Joining the Los Angeles Conservancy is a big one for me. That has been I think I'm about 6 or 8 months in, but it's been really great to see how that organization operates, see and understand what they do to advocate for historic places. I will also say that relocating to California was something that was very overwhelming for me. I grew up in southern New Mexico. Even Austin, Texas was not a large city. And so knowing that there's 30 million people within 100 miles of me right now was a little bit overwhelming, but I found my job that I love to do, and I've found a good place, and I'm happy to be in Southern California now.
Very good. What are some challenges you have faced in your career?
Challenges, learning and understanding the historic preservation world was a challenge, but having David as my mentor was a big part of being able to transition to that successfully.
Can you elaborate on some of those challenges, please?
Absolutely. When I came out of school, out of college, with a master's degree, I was this bold, I'm going to design the next tallest building in the world, engineer. Quickly realized that those are not designed and built very often. And pivoting to existing buildings and in particular historic structures, you quickly realize that behind every wall on historic buildings, you can pretend you might know what you're going to find, but it's often very different than what you expect. And so the challenge is making that work in a way that allows for the historic fabric and nature of the building to continue to be seen as historically relevant. So seeing and understanding what we have to work with versus a new building where we can specify what we have to work with is a huge challenge in the preservation world.
Sure. What is one thing you wish somebody had told you when you were establishing your career?
Work hard, be curious, ask questions, attend events within the industry, and don't be afraid to try and fail sometimes. Because if you go to work for good people, and if you're not working for good people, think about trying to find them. But if you go to work for good people, they will be there to support you, and ultimately you'll find yourself in a good place. And that's definitely my situation.
Good career advice for anyone, really.
Yes, agreed.
What is a particularly meaningful or rewarding part of your job?
I tell my staff all the time that we have the best staff in the business here at Structure Focus. I really enjoy working with the people that are on staff here at Structure Focus. I think they're all brilliant, and I really enjoy working with them, working beside them, learning from them. And then, in particular, as it relates to historic preservation, I really enjoyed, and I mentioned this about the Wilshire Boulevard Temple, but a lot of building owners are most interested in doing the cheapest solution. And it's really enjoyable to work for an owner who is interested in what we do. We get an opportunity to talk to them about some of the higher analysis opportunities that exist so that we can help them improve their building in a seismic event. And that's really exciting when we meet a client that is like that and have the opportunity to talk with them and explain a little bit more in depth about what we do.
Excellent. So we've gotten a few questions from the audience. So I'm just going to
Okay.
start from the top.
Okay.
Alex is asking, could you detail more about the seismic retrofit of the dome, which I'm assuming is the the Wilshire Temple?
Absolutely. So what was really interesting is that the dome at the Wilshire Boulevard Temple consists of an outer concrete dome and an inner plaster dome that's hung from the outer concrete dome. When you start evaluating the building, the dome itself is actually in really good shape because it's at the top of the building. There's compared to the rest of the building, there's less mass associated with the dome, and so we didn't actually have to do anything to the dome in terms of seismic retrofit. It's at the lower levels, particularly where you get down to the large sanctuary, which is below that large dome, that we needed to strengthen and even add some new structural elements to resist seismic loads. So while working on a dome building is wonderful and it creates a great picture, the challenge of that project was more related to how we incorporate new concrete shear walls and strengthen existing concrete shear walls to retrofit the building.
The next question is, what skills were most valuable for you to have in the beginning of your career?
Early in my career, listening is a big one. Coming out of school, my technical knowledge was good, but listening so that I could transition into the professional world was something that has a steep learning curve, quite honestly. And so I needed to understand that in school, it's about solving a problem, and you can spend as much time as you're willing to put in to do that. In the professional world, it's about running a business. And if you don't run the business successfully, then you can't pay your employees and the business no longer exists. So listen and learn and be a sponge and absorb the business side of things so that you can successfully be involved in the company and ultimately grow into a leadership position, which I would not have thought I would be where I am today, but I'm happy to be here.
Excellent. Christy has asked what happened to the milk parlor in Ontario.
So we went out and took a look, and it turns out the building was not impossible to relocate, and it did not need to be torn down. And we wrote a report that said that. I have since been contacted about another two similar milking parlors that we are not under contract yet to go look at. But as far as I know, those buildings are still sitting where they were, and I don't know what the future holds for them. But we were successful in disputing the developer's claim that those buildings need to be torn down. And I'm hopeful that our report will help to make sure that they are at least buildings that will be either relocated or continue to remain where they are, and the developer finds another site.
Excellent. Paul has asked, what techniques can be used to keep retrofit infrastructure less visible?
It's an art, which is a big challenge. The Barnes relocation project is a really good example of that. We used some custom steel plates and steel rods that were painted white to blend in with the interior white painting of the barns. And we worked closely with the architect to do our best to hide them in areas that could be concealed behind some large timber posts. But what's interesting about historic preservation is that if something needs to be done that clearly was not original to the building or can't be done in a way that doesn't stick out like a sore thumb, then the idea is to make it such that the visitor experience recognizes that that is not something that was original, but in our situation is really needed to make the building seismically retrofit in a safe way.
So not creating a false sense of history.
Yes, thank you.
Lisandro asks, how would you summarize the structural process part of a historic preservation process, and what is the most challenging part of the historic preservation process?
The most challenging part is the first phase where you've got to start digging in and finding out what you have. And that involves a lot of times putting on your grubbies and crawling into crawl spaces and weaving your way through spider webs. And I found uh, a cat that had been mummified, which
I knew where
is
you were going with that.
terrifying. But once we realized that it was had been there for a long time, but you never know what's around the next corner, I guess is my point, both from a structural standpoint and also just the history of the structure or the location. So that's definitely the first challenge. The process, excuse me. The process involves, like I said, figuring out what you're dealing with, working with the architect, and working within the architect's research to identify the historic defining features of the building, making sure that those are held in in such a way that they're preserved and not uh, affected by the work that we're doing. And then at that point, it's I won't say very much like a normal process, but there's always coordination with the architect, with the design team, with the client. And it's particularly challenging in historic preservation because that coordination work is always done with the backdrop of the existing building and the existing historic nature of the building.
The big unknowns.
Yep.
A two-part question for you.
Okay.
Do you have any academic or training recommendations for an emerging professional in the field of preservation that is interested in learning more about the structural component of buildings? And the second half of that is, what reference books or guidelines would you recommend for engineers working on historic buildings?
I'll take the second one first.
I was going to say, let me know if you need me to repeat it.
No. So there are books that have been put together that have sort of the history of how things were built in terms of like wood framing here in the United States has evolved in ways that that reference is a great way to go back and say, okay, we're looking at a house that was built in the 1940s. How do they put things together when that was done? So that's a really good reference book that we have in our library here at my office. In terms of academic and training type things, those local historic preservation organizations, CPF puts on a lot of really good educational presentations. Los Angeles Conservancy does the same. They do a lot of site tours, so you can get a chance to go and see some of these buildings and just educating yourself about what makes them historic and learning from the people that are doing the presentation and have worked on those projects are really your best options to get educated in a way where you're in a good spot to work on historic projects.
The next question is, can you share any suggestions to prepare accurate construction cost estimates for a historical building or structure? Good luck with that one.
Yeah, exactly. That's always a that's always a loaded question. Just tell me what you think. I won't hold you to it.
Assumptions are your key there.
Yes. So the secret to getting a good cost estimate is working with a contractor who has experience working on historic preservation projects. They understand, what you said earlier, Carrie. What you don't know, you don't know. So there's always unknowns, and they understand that you need to build that into your estimate of cost. and ultimately your bid if you're going to bid on the project, which is a challenge because there are a lot of really, really good contractors out there, but if they don't have the experience, a lot of times they're not even eligible because they can't get pre-qualified to work on a historic preservation project. So finding those contractors that can do a really good job on projects of these types is the key to really getting a good understanding of what the construction cost is going to be. And good contractors can, even walk a site with you for an hour and come up with a rough order magnitude or a range of what it should cost. But finding them is the real challenge.
I'm going to add on to that. Are you ever asked to review a contractor's bid and provide input on the cost and what your thoughts on the scope of work, proposed scope of work are?
Absolutely. We don't comment on the cost because that's something that we stay away from because we don't know. They're out in the weeds of it and know material costs and labor costs, and that's not something that we even have the expertise to follow.
Sure.
But we always or often review bids for quantities. So if I'm, in the Barnes restoration project at Rancho Los Alamitos, I know I've got a detail that shows a bunch of, 1/4-inch steel plates that are custom fabricated to receive a turnbuckle, or not a turnbuckle, a clevis at one end and has some holes in it for screws going into existing wood posts. And if I see that they don't have, steel plate to cover the number of custom fabricated steel hardware that I know there is, then that's something I'll comment on.
Okay.
And it's really about just making sure that the contractor has the scope of your design covered. And so that's what we're looking for when we review contractor bids.
Makes sense. Natalie is asking what type of CAD programs are being used today. Are there any specific ones used with respect to historic preservation?
We use AutoCAD and Revit. Revit can be a challenge because it's designed or set up to draw straight lines, and new buildings can be straight lines. Historic projects, over time, they morph into squiggly lines, I'll say. And so we know that in a building, a post at the second floor aligns with a post at the first floor because the building's been standing for a long time. But when you do a survey of the second floor and you overlay it with a survey of the first floor, those two don't always align. And so Revit's not a great source when it comes to historic projects. We've used it and we rely heavily on the architect to put those initial model together, and then we'll weave our structural elements into it. But for us, drawing production is always through AutoCAD and Revit, Autodesk Revit.
All right. I don't know if this is the same Natalie or not, but what is your opinion on the current climate of ecotourism and historic renovation?
I will say that the passion, and so many of you on this Zoom are driving that passion, is there. I hope it's always there. I know that in times when business has been challenging for us, our historic preservation projects tend to keep us going. And I think that, and I hope that will always be the case. And so I'm optimistic about the future as it relates to historic preservation.
The next question is a follow-up question to the milk parlor in Ontario. Were there
Yep.
particular structural challenges to relocating the building, or was the primary issue conflict with the client regarding the retaining the building? Thank you.
Yeah. Great question. So when you move a building, the foundations can't go with the building. And so in those barn photos that I showed, you're basically lifting the structure up off at the foundation level and then abandoning those foundations. You build new foundations at the new location, and then you set the building back on those. in the milking parlor project or building, it had a concrete masonry unit stem wall that went up about to 4 feet and maybe 5 feet high. So moving that wasn't going to be feasible, but it was all wood framed above that. And that was part of the reason that the developer had said that there's no way it could be moved. It's a concrete masonry structure. And it wasn't until I got to the site that I realized it's only concrete masonry at about shoulder level, and the top portion could absolutely be picked up, and you could build those stem walls at the new site and set it back on those. So that was the driving force behind the project being challenging, and that the developer didn't know what they were dealing with, and to be honest, didn't take the time to look and to know what they were dealing with. And so that
Never.
that's how we came to our report that said, yes, you could save this building, or at least enough of it to
Relocate
be
it.
able to recognize it. Yep.
If I could interrupt, I'm assuming the developer was not your client.
Correct.
Definitely not.
Oh, no, wait, I'm sorry. No, yes, that they were,
They were
because
the client.
well, they
And-
were required to have a study done and a
okay.
report written. And so we, I told them I can't decide from here that that building can't be moved, and I'll need to come out and take a look. And I did, and I wrote them a report. They didn't fire me based on that report, but they, I hope that I educated them that it can be moved, and these projects are worth moving.
Have you had a similar project like that before that you had to stick to your guns and that did result in you or your firm being fired from the project because you weren't giving them the answer that they were looking for?
Not necessarily fired from the project. It's common that when a historic preservation project comes along or a building comes along, the first step is to do an evaluation. And so we've done several evaluations that have resulted in reports and recommendations, not in terms of creating construction documents to rehabilitate or retrofit the building, but conceptual level, markups that aren't in depth enough to do a construction project. And so we have had some experiences where we go to that level. A lot of times they'll do a cost estimate on that. And at that point, the owner doesn't come back to us. Can't name a specific project where we didn't continue on. And I know that it was ultimately retrofit or rehabilitated. But I suspect there have been a few. And not all historic preservation projects are high profile enough that you would see that or notice that.
Sure. Sorry to interrupt, just satisfying my personal curiosity here.
No problem.
I'll hand it back.
So just kind of drawing on that. So it sounds like, Russell, you've been brought in on occasion to do a feasibility study.
Absolutely.
And based on the results of that, the owner or developer may choose to move forward or not, is kind of summarizing what you just said. Is that an accurate representation?
It is. And there are times that they have requirements. For example, the project we worked on, this theater in East Los Angeles that was called the Unique Theater,
Oh, that.
and it was very unique.
And not just in name.
Correct. Pun intended, I guess. But yeah, that project, I was called out by Adrian Fine, who's now the president and CEO of the Los Angeles Conservancy. At that time, he was on staff there, and Linda Dishman was in the president and CEO role. Anyway, he was going out because the building, the historic Unique Theater building, was directly adjacent to a new construction project that was next door, and was a wood-framed multifamily housing project that caught on fire. And the fire, arson, okay. The fire jumped over to the theater and burned the roof down over the entire back portion of the building, and they collapsed. So what was this in that project, the front facade and the lobby were really the historic elements that were still standing. They were severely damaged, a lot of smoke and a lot of scorch marks, but the and it was in county jurisdiction, I believe.
It is, it was county. It's
Um,
unincorporated. East LA is unincorporated LA County.
so so they were required to not just bulldoze that building, and the owner was required to keep and restore it back to its original condition. And you might know the status more than I do because we haven't been
This is
involved since then.
this Russell and I both worked on this project. This is when I first met Russell. So not only was it did it catch on fire when the neighboring new construction caught on fire, but squatters set the building on fire 2 more times. So the last time I saw Russell at the site, they were looking at reinforcing the auditorium walls because there was nothing left in between and shoring up. But I understand the county wants to turn it into low income permanent support housing, I think for veterans. I know that's what's next door. I may be confusing it with this one, but they were still looking for a private partner to finance that, the last I heard.
Okay.
Um,
So still in the works.
Still in the works, to be determined, but hopefully shored up and secured from impromptu barbecues. The next question is, do you find that certain projects are more historically sensitive than others, resulting in a different approach? In those more historically sensitive projects, do you use an argument that archaic materials meet the needs of the project, but not necessarily modern code?
Absolutely. This is a great opportunity to talk about the California Historical Building Code, which is a document that has saved many historic buildings, and for good reason. The the Historical Building Code understands that upgrading all buildings to current code is not going to be feasible for a lot of these buildings. And so it makes an effort to protect life safety, but allow for the use of the original fabric of the building that, to be perfectly honest, has done just fine over the life of the building. But in today's world, those aren't acceptable structural elements, particularly as it relates to seismic. So in that situation, utilizing the California Historical Building Code uh, is a huge tool to be able to rehabilitate and retrofit historical buildings and save them for future generations.
The next question is, could you share the name of the book about framing that you mentioned?
I can, but I don't have it off the top of my head. I apologize.
Or if you don't have it right in front of you, perhaps you can follow up with John and Lisa and they can
Sure.
share it with the group.
Absolutely.
Yeah, if you get it to us sometime later today, Russell, we can send it out with the follow-up email to the program.
Will do. I
Thanks, sir.
apologize for
Oh,
mentioning something that I didn't have on the top of my head.
all right. So stay tuned on that. What kind of adaptive reuse projects have you worked on?
Adaptive reuse. One of my favorites, not a historic building, but it is in Playa del Rey here in the Los Angeles area, adjacent to Marina del Rey. It's an existing 400 by 500 foot former U.S. Postal sorting facility, big warehouse building, tilt-up concrete panel walls, and it was being developed into creative office space. And so the developer took that, call it a square building, and cut a slot right down the middle so that off the parking lot, you would walk down this courtyard that was open air, and that allowed for more building perimeter for front doors to these office locations. So that is an area that is known as Silicon Beach here in Los Angeles. And so there's a lot of high tech entertainment type tenants in the building, um, like TMZ, Sony's in there, Verizon's in there. Um, so that is a little bit of a crossover with the work that we do in the entertainment industry. We've worked for all of those high tech clients, and we worked on all of not just the core and shell of the building to transition it to a creative office space building, but also we did the tenant build outs for those companies that I just mentioned. And in fact, we've done all the build outs for in that building. So that's an adaptive reuse one. We're currently working on a building in downtown Long Beach that is a unreinforced masonry building that they're looking to turn into residential, which is a challenge because that's a change of use for the building. And so there's some requirements per the code that kick in related to that. But the good news is the California Historical Building Code provides some tools to allow for that. And in this situation, we're going to be able to restore the building to its original splendor and also allow for housing.
Very good. Next question is, you mentioned you got your structural engineering license several years after your PE license. What additional requirements were there for the SE?
The big one is experience working under a licensed structural engineer. And you take an exam. It's morphed over the years, but for me, the structural engineering exam was 2 consecutive days of 8-hour exams. I went out to the fairgrounds in Pomona, and they're long days getting from my house on the west side to the Pomona Fairgrounds for a 8 a.m. start and a full 9-hour day with a 1-hour lunch break to go home and then turn around and go back the next day. Was a challenge, but in terms of the requirements, it's mainly just experience working under the oversight of a licensed structural engineer. And you have to document that experience when you apply to take the exam.
So it's a journeyman system similar to a licensed architect.
Yep.
Cool. Lisa was adding on to that question, but she has stopped. So if you could choose any other career in preservation, what would it be and why?
Any other career in preservation? Um,
When you
I
retire, what are you going to do when you retire? Let's put it that way.
I'm gonna go visit all these places that I helped save. Um, I probably would say that working on the contractor side is where I would go, mainly because, uh, like I said earlier, the exciting part of historic preservation is peeling back the skin of the onion and seeing what's on the inside. And so we do that in an investigative manner in areas that we handpick based on, revealing the most that we can find. But then the contractor comes in and peels all of the layers back, and you find stuff that even we couldn't anticipate based on the investigation that we had done. So I think that is the exciting part that I talked about earlier related to onboarding for on a historic preservation project, and contractors get to take it a step further, understanding that, well, they get paid a whole lot more, but also they take a lot more risks. So, but it's exciting.
Like being an anesthesiologist. So, this is a perfect segue into, is there a dream project or projects, far-fetched or attainable, you would love to work on someday? And the person who posed the question suggested the Duomo in Florence comes to mind, given your love of domes.
Absolutely. I'd love to work on the Domo. I would say that, um, you know, my initial, for very first historic preservation project being the Hotel del Coronado, I'll tell a brief little story. I had the opportunity to go down. We had 2 days worth of work to do, so the hotel put us up overnight. They knew that we were on the renovation team, and so they gave me the 3rd floor corner room facing the ocean. And this, I'll say kid from New Mexico who never would have dreamed that he ever would have gotten close to that room. So that was a great experience. That that building will always be one of my favorite buildings. The Wilshire Boulevard Temple will always be one of my favorite buildings. I actually put up the big projects in my career that are my favorite buildings. In terms of a dream building, I think I kind of crack up and in that we really don't know here in the United States what history is. When you go to Europe, working on some of those buildings, um, they are truly historic. And I don't mean that in any way to say that we shouldn't be preserving what we have, but in terms of truly being challenged with archaic uh, systems and materials, that would probably be the next step in terms of me getting an opportunity to experience that.
And then Aaron asked that they often get owners saying the building is not structurally sound. We had an engineer come and look at it, but they often don't provide any further data or reports. Are there some top structural elements that cause the building to be deemed a must demolish?
Not necessarily structural elements. I've seen severe deterioration that could ultimately or potentially put a building in that situation. For example, I've worked on a historic house in Riverside for many, many years that has some of the worst termite damage I've ever seen in my life. But in that situation, um, we we tend to say here at Structural Focus that um, we can accomplish almost anything, but it depends on how much you have to spend. So in this situation that I'm talking about with the termite damage, as long as you're able to control the termite infestation, then there's no reason that the termite damaged material can't stay in place. So if you've got studs that are basically completely compromised, you can come in and supplement those studs with new stud framing. Same thing with joists. And so, that's in that situation, we're working hard to do our best to save the building. Um, and I've never recommended that a historic building gets torn down.
So Russell, I like to say time and money can fix all problems. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. All is a big term, but I've yet to come across one that wasn't savable.
Whether there is time or money is a different scenario, but
Absolutely. You're right. So not all of them get saved, but um, we're
so
hopeful that we can at least convince somebody to, if they can't afford to do it or don't have the time to do it, then don't do anything and sell to somebody who can, which is not something we can force them to do.
that is
Through
true. Although
advocacy sometimes.
for the city of Ontario, I have been tasked with trying to give away buildings a couple times because they were on site slated for redevelopment, and it's one of the mitigation measures identified in their EIR. So,
Hmm.
which is a fun process. Who wants a free building?
Hmm.
So, Lisa and John, we have about 5 minutes left. Do you want to ask any questions yourself, or do you need?
I do have one more question. It's not actually structural engineering related, but related to the Hotel Dell. And it is if you've ever
Okay.
seen any of the spirits that allegedly haunt its corridors.
I have not. I've heard stories, and um, I'm not one who was particularly concerned as we were going up through an attic access that led to, areas that if I was a ghost, I would hang out in. Um, but have heard the stories, know a little bit of the history, and it it's what made the project even more exciting. And that's a
Sure, you
rich part
never
of
know
their
what you're going to come
history.
across around the next corner.
Exactly.
A mummified cat, perhaps.
Right? Exactly. Yeah, no, that was my I was spending many years in San Diego. That was my question, if you'd
Oh, okay.
ever seen any of those spirits. So
I have not.
well, maybe next time. Who knows? The next time you come back, maybe they'll seek you
Yes.
out.
Yes.
John, did you have one?
It's kind of a maybe changing course from your question, but My question for Russell really is like, what's the most challenging material that you've had to deal with as a structural engineer?
Unreinforced masonry and wood framed buildings, a lot of times houses with plaster as their main seismic force resisting system. A lot of times we can come in and add plywood on those walls, but not always. And so, you know, like for example, the house that I've worked on for a long time in my career, the perimeter wood siding could be taken off and we could add plywood on the exterior, but the interior plaster was historically relevant, and so we were doing our best to not touch it. So those two are certainly challenging. And the beauty of the historical building code is that, you know, URM as an archaic material can be used. It's not a great material, but we know what it can do and what it can't do. And so if we can make it work, we do.
One last question. In the same light, does water intrusion almost always mean that materials or structural is compromised?
For some materials, we've done some adobe projects. Water and adobe don't particularly like to get along. But in general, well, concrete, if the concrete's older and any reinforcing or steel within the concrete starts to rust, that tends to spall concrete. But for example, like a steel building that is showing what looks like severe rust, in general, you can clean that rust off. What a lot of people don't know is that when steel rusts, it expands by about 10 times. And that's what ultimately causes spalling of concrete when the steel starts to rust. But in those situations, you can clean that rust off, and you ultimately realize that the surface rust really didn't degrade too much of the material. And so you're not in a situation where it's compromised.
Right.
But you can be. We've all seen some severely rusted steel elements that need to be either replaced or supplemented, or it just
Yeah,
depends on the
absolutely.
situation.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Russell, for joining us today and being so generous with your time, leading us through your journey, and of course, for this extensive Q&A. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure that our audience did as well. Thank you also to Carrie for moderating today's program. Our next Path to Preservation program will take place on Tuesday, May 20th. It will feature Stephen Schaefer, an architectural photographer specializing in archival, large format black and white photography that meets the rigorous Historic American Buildings Survey, or HABS standards. I'll be sure to post the link to register for that program in the chat. On behalf of myself, the staff here at CPF, our education co-chairs, thank you all for joining us again today. We really hope you enjoyed the program and encourage you to leave your feedback or suggest future program topics using the survey you'll be directed to upon closing your Zoom window. Massive thank you again to Russell for spending your lunch hour with us, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your afternoons. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.